Hey, welcome back to another episode of Work Comp Talk. Yes, it does look very different today, and you can blame it on this one. Actually, more so on my nose and the infections going on. But I don't have COVID. I do want to keep my coworkers healthy and not pass any virus that I have going on. So we did decide to do virtual. So you might see cats, might hear dogs barking. Who knows? We're virtual now. So just for this episode, please bear with us. And we do want to thank everyone who has been listening to our podcast. And those that are new, welcome. Subscribe to any of your favorite pod channels. You can find us on pretty much every single one of them. If we're not on your favorite pod platform, make sure you let us know so that we can submit so that our podcast goes on there. Today, there is a lot to talk about, but first, I want to take out the way all the sponsors for today's show, which is Specific Workers, the lawyers for injured workers. If you've been injured at work and you've decided, you know what, I might just tackle this on my own and realize, it's not as easy as you thought, you want to get an amazing legal team behind you. And those are Pacific Workers, the lawyers for injured workers. You can give them a call at 800-606-6999, serving all of Northern California. And even if you're somewhere in California that's not in the northern part, we might just have connections as well and can connect you with one of the best top workers' comp in your area. Without further ado, Bilal Kassem is joining me today along with your host, Carmen. Bilal, welcome to the virtual Work Comp Talk.
Happy to be here as always.
And you're just happy you don't get to get a virus.
Yeah, well, I appreciate this being remote today because I really don't want to get sick. So It works out.
I don't want to get anyone sick at the office. So I'm super excited that we're able to do this again. Kind of like in the old days. Remember, we were doing this in the beginning during the pandemic. Actually, no, you weren't really part of the virtual ones. It was Eric.
I think I dropped in for a couple of the episodes, I think maybe, but
yeah, it was in the beginning. It was totally different. I kind of got used to the studio. I do like the quality and the sound of everything. So I do apologize for those that have catched on to our audio and our video and like watching those videos. It is going to be slightly different. I promise you we'll try to make the best of it. But today I didn't want to stop recording. There's so much to talk about within workers' comp. And, there's a lot happening. I was looking at the news yesterday, Bilal, and I was realizing how expensive gas has become. The news reporter had sent out on a mission to figure out what was the cheapest gas you can find in the San Mateo County area.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to say they found one in Millbrae, which was at almost $5.95 per gallon. The most expensive one was almost $7. We are in dear times. The economy is turning into something that's going to potentially head into crisis. Well, would you agree or maybe?
Yeah, I mean, if you've been watching the stock market since December, I think a lot of stocks, including NASDAQ, which is a lot of big companies, down almost 30%. The S&P index down almost 20%. Federal Reserve's talking about further rate hikes and clearing their balance sheets, which further brings stocks down. Talking about raising mortgage interest rates pretty much every week since January. Baby food formula shortage across the country. Gas prices, just consumer goods, wheat prices going up because of the war in Ukraine. I think just across the board, things are looking pretty ugly these days.
They are definitely looking pretty ugly. So today's topic leads to us discussing about how does this and if this does affect workers' comp in any way, shape, or form. There's going to be layouts. People are going to be laid off, cuts left and right. Many people might not want to pursue a workers' comp claim because they might feel like I might get fired and then I won't find a job that easily. There's so many factors that come into play when there's a crippled economy that can affect workers' comp. And that's what we're going to dive into today. So Bilal, tell us a little bit how one marries the other. When the economy is going to hell, how does that affect workers' comp? And does that affect in any way, shape, or form the workers' comp system?
So I think the first thing that we can touch on is solvency issues. A lot of people, and you see this whether or not the economy is good or bad, are concerned about whether or not their employer's bankruptcy or going out of business will affect their existing cases. It's probably the number one question I get all the time, whether or not we're in a bad economy. And the answer to that is pretty straightforward. Normally in workers' comp in California, most employers have workers' comp insurance. there's an alternative where employers can actually be self-insured, which means they cover the cost of claims by themselves. But that's fairly rare unless you're a city or, a giant company like Disney or something like that. But if you're a normal mom and pop shop, small business, whatever, you have workers' comp insurance. And so generally speaking, an employer's solvency doesn't really matter. Your employer can go out of business, and as long as they had coverage at the time of your injury, you're good shape. And even if the insurance company goes out of business, which is probably more of a concern, California has something called CIGA, which is the California Insurance Guarantee Association, which actually comes in and backs up the insurance companies in case they have to liquidate, they go bankrupt, or whatever the case may be. And so just as a base, all cases are fairly much guaranteed by the state of California. So that's one separate issue. Another issue, which I think you touched on, is whether or not we see a difference in claims, or there's any kind of relationship between a bad economy in general and whether or not people report claims, get hurt, the outcome of their cases and stuff like that. And absolutely, it's a big deal. I think just as a baseline, people are more reluctant to file cases to begin with because they're afraid that if they report an injury, they're going to get put on work restrictions and they're not going to be able to go back to work.
It's a definitely life-changing decision. Do I take care of this injury? Can it heal on its own? It brings up a lot of questions. Maybe I can just pretend like it didn't happen at work, get it taken care of however I can, and hope for the best. At the end of the day, that's pretty much the only thing you can do if you think in that way.
Yeah. And some injuries, I think, where maybe people were more prone to report them before, I guess you can call them wobblers, right? Where it's like kind of an injury, but like, maybe this is something I can just ice and treat at my home with, I could put on a sling or a brace. I can ice it. I can take some over the counter, pain medication, anti-inflammatories and stuff. Maybe I could take like a few days sick time and couple that with a weekend. And then, I can get back into it. When the economy's great, when there's plenty of jobs, I think a lot of people report those injuries.
Of course.
Because they don't have that fear on the back end. But, I think in a bad economy, those are the types of injuries where people are like, hey, I can't afford to lose this job. I have rent, I have bills, I have credit card debt, whatever the case is. And it's more meaningful for them to stay employed because they're really scared about being able to find meaningful employment afterwards.
Definitely. It's a scary situation, even if you're not injured, let alone having a work injury. It's changing the lives of many people. Whatever happens out in the economy does affect everyone in some way, shape, or form. You spoke earlier about the interest rates for mortgages going up every freaking week. Imagine that person that has a goal in mind, right? As of last year, to buy a house, they get injured, the interest rates are going up. The last thing they want to do is leave their job and not know if they're going to be able to fulfill that goal. It's a ripple effect.
Yeah, you can't. It's with the rising interest rates, at least in the Bay Area, when you're talking about how much houses cost, you're chasing a carrot.
Yeah,
it's just being constantly dangled in front of you, and affordability is constantly moving further and further away. And being out of work just exacerbates the situation even more. And I think for a lot of people in the Bay Area, it's already unaffordable, and trying to make life affordable when costs of goods and stuff are rising and housing's rising, it's very difficult just to get by as is, let alone trying to do that with an injury. So, I think for most people, a bad economy is felt in magnitudes more, depending on where you're at in the Bay Area, particularly. Look, tech's been booming here for the last 10, 20 years. And, a stock market with the Fed printing money and basically propping up everything throughout the pandemic. And even before that, I think a lot of people felt as though tech in California was like the gold rush and it was never going to end. And here we are looking at, companies now who have already talked about hiring freezes and stuff, and companies who have laid off a ton of people like Netflix. And I feel like it's only the tip of the iceberg.
Yikes. It's a kind of like one of those band-aids that we don't want to rip off, but you kind of have to rip off. And that's why we wanted to dive into this topic in particular, because like you said, there are so many components that can change the reasoning behind someone wanting to submit a claim, or in general, just people being afraid and not knowing if this case is going to be able to carry them out throughout the duration of their healing process. There's just so many questions that we can dive into that could potentially go into someone's head. You know, you did talk about being covered, no worries if your company goes out of business, if they go bankrupt, if they don't have insurance that's supposed to cover for workers' comp and injured workers. There's things to protect in every way, shape, or form. So, what would be another reason why someone would be nervous to even carry out a workers' comp or be affected when the economy is crippling the way we're seeing ours now?
So in most workers' comp cases, while someone's healing, they get temporary work restrictions. And those temporary work restrictions are in place because the physician feels as though the person needs to be off of work or restricted from certain activity because they won't be able to heal otherwise. At the end of the case, typically someone gets permanent work restrictions. And that's when it's determined by a physician that these are the things that this person needs to avoid, at least for the foreseeable future, to avoid further injury. It's kind of like, this is for sure going to be bad if you do this, right? Like,
Yeah.
if you have, a herniated disc in your back, the doctor's probably going to tell you to avoid lifting, 100 pounds or more, right? It's just not good for you. And so once you get those permanent work restrictions, the employer then, depending on their size, has certain laws under ADA and FIA in California, which require them to engage in a good faith interactive process to determine whether or not they can actually bring you back to work. And if your work restrictions are far too prohibitive and they don't have any alternate or modified work, they can actually terminate you. And so if you're thinking about starting up a case and you're going to have work restrictions, your employer may end up canning you. And if your employer cans you and it's a rough economy and maybe there's not a lot of jobs available for you in the first place, let alone being limited by your injury, you might think twice about pursuing the case and really tough it out as long as you can, because in the long run, you're afraid that financially it's going to be a terrible decision for you.
But it's not. If you look at the bright side, and there's some components within the workers' compensation system that do benefit the worker. In this case, let's just say the person has a herniated disc. They can't go back to work without restrictions because they can't really carry out anything heavy. The economy is going to shut. There is the voucher. There is the opportunity for you to retake any type of certification. Let's just say you were working before in construction. Now you can do blueprints. Now you can become an architect some way, shape, or form, and you have the money because the state is going to help you, one. And then you have that voucher that also allows you to go to school, and it's a benefit that comes within workers' comp. You may not be going back to construction or to picking up heavy stuff. The economy might be falling down, but it's not going to end. And there's little holes of light, I guess you can see, that shed and allow you to kind of think really deeply into what you're going to do next with your life. It's, change is good. Sometimes we need things to happen to us for us to even change. Otherwise, we'll stick to the same job, to the same annoying manager, to the same rough job that's taking a toll on our body just because we're so afraid of change.
Yeah.
So this could be a good outcome.
Absolutely. And, to kind of take it back for a second, it doesn't mean that, those thoughts and feelings are right. I think at the end of the day, those are just the kind of things that people think.
Mm-hmm.
But coming from my perspective as a lawyer, I've seen people who have been injured on the job. They've tried to tough it out because they're worried about losing their job, and they just make the situation far worse. And when your medical condition is such that now you're really messed up and you can't work at all, maybe it would have been better for you to just see the writing on the wall, accept the fact that you have limitations, and address those limitations through filing a work comp case. And you're right, at the end of the day, most people in workers' comp get a settlement. Sometimes it's better than others, but for the most part, a lot of people will get a monetary amount that helps them through the next 6, 12, 2 years, 10 years, whatever the case may be, money in their pocket to help them then transition to the next stage in life, even if that means redirecting their career in a completely different path for something new, seemingly uncomfortable, but they have the finances and the support to be able to do that. And I think in the long run, that is a better option than simply trying to brush everything under the rug for fear of not being able to go back to work.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I'm glad you mentioned the word settlements, and I'm glad you're talking about the potential someone could get from a settlement. There is good settlements. There's settlements where a person can kind of even go on vacation if they need to, just to kind of get all that stress that they were dealing with along their workers' comp case before they even tackle or go back into the work industry. Now, with the crippled economy and the things that we're seeing now, gas prices rising and shit, there's no baby formula nowadays. What does that do to a settlement? Would an insurance company come back and possibly offer you less than? Is that even possible?
So I think it's worthwhile to explain settlements in California are generally based on statute. So when we look at work comp settlements, for the most part, we're talking about the permanent disability and we're talking about the medical care.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're talking about the permanent disability, which generally in workers' comp cases makes up the majority of the settlement, those numbers are set by statute in California and they have a monetary equivalent. And so if you have X percentage of permanent disability, your case is worth Y number of dollars. Gotcha. So, you have 10% permanent disability is worth $10,000 or, whatever it is, right? And as you go up in permanent disability percentages, it becomes more and more and more. And so I think it's a question of whether or not the money you're getting as a settlement is reflective of what financially you need to get by these days.
Mm-hmm.
And it's pretty old. The last rate change we had in permanent disability was 2014. And despite the increases in cost of living over the past 8 years, those rates haven't changed at all.
They haven't, but life has.
Yeah,
the economy has.
My rent's gone up. And so, I think through that lens, the insurance company only has to offer a certain amount of money for the permanent disability, because once the doctors weigh in on it, we're not fighting over whether a percentage has a certain monetary value. We're fighting with the doctors and the defense about whether the person has a low or high permanent disability rating in and of itself. But once that's done, the percentage and the amount corresponding to that is fixed by law. So,
yikes.
And yeah, there's a lot of push for reform, but it hasn't changed. Temporary disability rates, for example, change every single year based on cost of living. So, when I started workers' comp way back when, you had permanent disability rates of like $230 a week. In 2014, it went to $290 a week. It stayed the same. But for temporary disability, I've seen the rates go from like several $100s to now I think the max rate's like $1,500 per week. So it's changed with the times to compensate people accordingly for the temporary disability, but not the permanent disability. And that makes it really tough, especially when we see skyrocketing consumer goods and gas and things like that really affecting people's daily lives.
Imagine trying to live off of that
amount
for a week. Like, what the fuck? You can't even pay rent.
The good thing is that permanent disability can be paid while you're working. So if you were to relocate to a new job, you can actually still receive the benefit, versus temporary disability. It's designed as a wage loss, so you can't actually work at the same time.
Very interesting. So it does somehow, way, shape, or form affect the way someone can think. So if you're injured at home, sitting there pondering, should I come through with this? Should I just let it go? What should I do? It doesn't hurt to see an attorney. We've always mentioned this. Consulting with someone who knows the law, who understands the law, can help you answer those questions and guide you to a better decision, because there's a lot to be left on the table. You can either screw this up or make the most of it. It just depends, right? So we talked about settlements. We talked about being covered if a company goes out of business. What other ways would workers' comp be affected? Looking at the economy and the way it's going now.
I mean, you do see the insolvency issues that I talked about in the first place. And to some extent, does that matter for a workers' comp case? You have the insurance company there. And if the insurance company goes under, then you have, SIGA who's there. But even then, transitioning from the insurance company handling the case to SIGA from the state coming in and stepping in to fill in the shoes of the insurance company, that can delay things several months.
Heck yeah, it's a slow ass system already.
Yep. And I can tell you, years ago, I had a case where an insurance company, Lumbermans, had actually liquidated. They were insolvent in the middle of the case. And we were actually circulating settlement documents for everyone to sign when I get an email from the defense attorney that said, I have no more authority to do anything on this case. We're not settling. And so it was literally like the day of my client signing the settlement document, I got that email. Then we had to wait for the state to step in. The SIGA and their attorneys. And ultimately, they completely flipped the script and they wanted to fight the case all of a sudden. And they wanted to pay less money to my client. And that was already after a several month delay and having the transition between the two entities. And so, that caused problems.
Does that happen? Is that normal to happen for them?
Sometimes, it depends on the attorney and who's handling the case, but, there is a transition period that you see when it's being handed off because, all the files and information are being transferred from one entity to another. And if you're in the middle of a case, that can be really anxiety provoking, I guess. Yeah. Because you're sitting there and, my client thought, hey, this is great. I have a settlement. Everything's cool. I'm going to be done. And then nope. And I think after that, the case took almost another year to resolve.
It's almost like starting all over again.
Yeah, in some sense, it can be difficult.
That sucks, and here I am thinking, SIGA would be something that benefits the employer, the employee, the injured worker. It's that virus I have in my head. It's just, but more so, I think it's a state benefit. It should want to better the residents and not necessarily screw them over. Like it's almost shocking to me to hear that they kind of let's dig a little bit. Wait, you know what? We might not want to give you what the other ones thought. Like what? That's insane.
Yeah. So, and that happens all the time in cases. Sometimes defense attorneys will get fired, and they'll, the insurance adjuster will hire a new attorney, and all of a sudden, the defense attorney was terrible to work with, and the new one's great to work with, or vice versa. Or sometimes you get an adjuster swap on your file. So it does happen even outside of financial issues for the insurance carriers and such. But yeah, it adds complexity to the case, to say the least.
I was gonna say to say the least, like literally. Okay, so we do understand that there is options for people. What is one thing you can tell someone that's going through a case or that just started a case and is already seeing his household being affected by the economy and let alone being out of work? What could be a positive thing that a lawyer can tell an injured worker?
There is light at the end of the tunnel. If you do things right, you get with the right doctors, you go to the right QME, you get the right lawyer. Shameless plug for us. You can really make the most of a workers' comp case. I think if you don't know what you're doing and you're really scared about a workers' comp case or an injury, particularly affecting your ability to provide for yourself and your family, that it's not something you should experiment with, right? It's not the time to try and wing it. I think, hiring a professional and ensuring that you're getting the best care with the best doctors, your benefits are being paid at the right rates and at the right times and such. And ultimately that you're getting a settlement out of it that's going to be able to catapult you into the future for whatever your next endeavor is, whether it's going back to work or redirecting your career and your interests into something else that's more accommodating for whatever your disability is. Like that's hugely important. I wouldn't wing that. And with the right control, with the right people involved, like you can make the most of your case and you can walk away with a sense of decency and feel like justice was achieved.
Yeah.
Financially and morally.
Literally.
Both,
Well, speaking about a good attorney, we're going to take a quick break and show you guys a little bit of who Pacific Workers is and how they work. And maybe this is somebody you can eventually work with if ever you need to hire a workers' comp attorney.
Back in January 2017, it was just right after New Year's. I was on the computer replying back to emails. And the next thing you know, I'm feeling stabs in my back. I turn around and my manager, she stabbed me in the stomach. She had hallucinations. Her medication was causing it to attack me. I had a huge operation. They had to open me up and take out all my organs and make sure nothing happened. That time I was just so broken, asking what did I do to deserve this? I was just so confused as to why something like this happened at work. Something like this happened to me, of all people. The work insurance that I was with, I felt like they weren't helpful at all. But then I started realizing like, wait, there's lawyers for this. Maybe I can get help. Pacific Workers Comp. really took the time to hear me out, care for me, and reassure me that everything's gonna be okay. Everyone from admin to the lawyers, they're so welcoming.
Our clients have expectations of us to fight for them, to call them back, to communicate with them. This is about going above and beyond. This is about helping them where they could never have expected it. That's who we are.
It's not just their job to care about you, but they genuinely want you to succeed every step of the way. I would definitely recommend Pacific Workers Comp. I wasn't a believer at first. I didn't think anyone was going to help me, but this team really did.
Well, there you have it. There are attorneys here to help you out when you're involved in an injury at work and when you need help. And there are attorneys and there are attorneys. So there is a huge difference. As you can see, Pacific Workers definitely works completely different. The client service that is given to an injured worker is pretty much, if I can explain, is holding someone from their hand throughout a workers' comp case, walking every step of the way right next to them. Not once will you feel lost or what the heck's going on. Everything is very well explained. You're taken care of by a team of professionals, you don't just get the attorney and his phone number. No, you get an entire legal team behind it. So I think that's the positive. And there's a lot still that we can dive into in regards to the crumbling economy we have and we're living currently at this moment and injured workers. Bilal, there is an important aspect that we haven't touched yet, and that's the importance of having an amazing lawyer who can guide you to the best doctors. Again, people might think because the economy sucks, maybe I don't want to pay a lawyer. Maybe I have to pay out of pocket, or maybe I don't want to take some of my settlement and give it to a lawyer because I'm probably going to need that money. What are the weigh-ins if you have an attorney and if you don't?
So, for example, with the attorney fee, we actually take a fee from your settlement. It's no upfront fees. There's no payment unless we win. At the end of the day, that 15% that we usually take as our attorney fee is well worth the benefit that we actually got for the client. And, more often than not, we've quadrupled or had some multiple on what the case probably would have worth if they didn't have an attorney versus when they actually signed up with us. And, we walked them through the process and got them a good result. But really, when you have a bad economy, you can't play around with your workers' comp case. If you're not getting paid temporary disability at the right rate or at the right times, what are you going to do? How are you going to pay your rent? How are you going to pay your bills? If you get a terrible doctor who says, you know what, your arm's sawed off, but that was pre-existing, or, you don't really have the disability you say you do, you're just malingering and making it up, you need to go back to work, no restrictions. Then you're put into a predicament where you're telling your boss, like, I can't do the job because I'm physically injured. And your boss is waving a crappy doctor's report in your face saying, well, you don't have work restrictions. You should be able to do everything. And if you don't want to do everything, you're fired, and what are you going to do then? Or you get a bad QME who says, you know what, the treating physician's right. You don't have any disability. You don't have any work restrictions. Your case is worthless. And then you have the adjuster sending you a letter that says, we're closing our file. We're not authorizing any more medical care. We're not authorizing any benefits, nothing, go kick sand. That's it. And we see that all too often, even in a good economy. The problem is on the back end with a bad economy, what are you going to do? What other job are you going to get? What savings are you going to rely on? How are you going to afford to live off your savings when everything's like triple the price, if not unavailable? And I think trying to plan ahead and addressing the potential downside risk to a workers' comp case on the front end by ensuring that you're being represented by competent legal professionals is worth its weight in gold. It's incredibly important. It's, if not invaluable, to ensure that you have a good start in your workers' comp case from the get-go. And I think all too often I've seen a lot of clients come to us and the damage has been done. They already have been going through the system for 6 months or longer. They already have multiple bad doctors reports, not just from their treating physician, but from the QME involved in the case. That say nothing's wrong with them, no future medical, everything's pre-existing. But I can tell they just got the short end of the stick because they didn't really know what they were doing, and they ended up with bad doctors, bad professionals and such. And so when we have those cases come by, it's very difficult for us to unwind the damage.
Very much so. And it's important that you mentioned the bad doctors. I feel like we don't stress this enough. When someone comes to you as a doctor, say you just got injured, you go to the clinic or the workers' comp clinic that they send you to, you're trusting the doctor to want to make you feel better or to want to work with you, right? But there's doctors that are sided more towards the insurance. There are doctors that are plain neutral, doctors that just want to make a quick buck. And the importance of having an attorney, and not just at Pacific Workers, most of attorneys have more than one case. Here at Pacific Workers, we've helped thousands of injured workers, dealt with so many doctors, probably all of the doctors you can think of. And there are names that stick out to an attorney like, oh yeah, I remember this doctor. We might not want to work with this doctor. It's never been favorable ever. Why would it be favorable this time? Those are also benefits that, you can add by having that person that's been through the system more than once. It's like not necessarily a walk in the park for an attorney, but it's definitely not walking blindfolded for sure, because you have that information. You have who you can work with. You know the law, and there's so many benefits to that. And the importance of having a doctor. I mean, I've seen injury cases and injured workers work with doctors that heal some of the athletes, the most famous athletes that are playing in some of the Bay Area teams currently at this moment. Doctors that treat them, that are still working as chiropractors for them, treat injured workers as well.
Yeah, we work with the Warriors team doctor on a fair number of cases, which obviously, they're a competent medical professional. So there are great doctors out there. I think just like lawyers, there, and just companies or insurance adjusters or whatever industry you're in, not all professions and people are at the same standard. And I think people have competing interests. Some are insurance oriented, some are injured worker, applicant oriented, and everything in between. And, I have to share real quick, there's a horror story for a case I had at one point. It was a gentleman who was a chef in San Francisco for almost 20 years. And I don't know if you know chefs, but, it's not this pretty experience like Gordon Ramsay, like just sitting around eating delicious food and screaming at people for fun. I think they do backbreaking labor, lifting 50-pound sacks of potatoes and like carrying around frozen goods on their feet for 12, 14 hours, like running around like crazy high pressure cooker type environment. It's really taxing. And this gentleman had a back injury and he went to a QME, and sure enough, the QME said that he didn't have a back injury caused by work. It was all non-industrial. And
you sneezed and you threw your back out.
Yeah. It's all at home. The fact that you're doing backbreaking labor as a chef for 20 years didn't have anything to do with it. And this gentleman worked consistently for that period of time. You're not talking about taking a few years off here and there. He wasn't working construction on the side or whatever, it was. And the sad thing is, it wasn't just a normal back injury. This gentleman had a failed lumbar surgery. And so ultimately he had to have a pain pump installed for his spine. And basically you're talking about someone who's in such excruciating pain all the time. They need to be on like a drip system of drugs, basically constantly, to just not go insane. And so you're talking about someone who's literally probably never going to be able to work ever again. And here you have a doctor that said, nope, not work comp related. And you have an insurance company saying you get nothing. And he had unfortunately come to us before, the QME was selected and such. And so I had to try and undo a lot of the damage. And I got him a pretty good result. I got him a big 6-figure result, which still was not enough. But given the risk of having to get nothing and such, I felt like it was in his best interest and his family's interest to grab it. And so I'm very happy that they got, a pretty big 6-figure settlement rather than having to deal with nothing. And to give an example of how bad this doctor was, the doctor in deposition had actually testified that he felt as though there was no such thing as cumulative trauma for someone's spine, and that he didn't care what this gentleman's job was or what his job duties were because he didn't believe in that type of injury. And so,
wow.
Again, this wasn't a QME I picked.
Doctor.
Exactly. But that can be the type of doctor out there. And if you don't understand that if I saw that doctor on a list for a QME panel, he would be one of the first I struck and got rid of. I
You're
wouldn't choose him as the evaluator.
Heartless doctor.
Yes. And so that's the kind of
Dude, for all we
people.
know, he's the type of doctor that gets the people. Have you seen the movies where the doctors come and they pay for patients and they torture the shit out of them in these private abandoned mass buildings? I wouldn't be surprised that's the type of doctor you guys are looking at. I'm just kidding.
Yeah, but like if you're an injured worker, you want to go to that guy? Like, hell no. Like I wouldn't go there. I wouldn't send my parents there, my friends there, anyone I cared about to that person for an evaluation. Like that's terrible. Like just at a baseline, that harsh reality is something that unfortunately a lot of inexperienced injured workers go through because they don't know any better. And they think, oh, well, I'm going to go to this doctor. He's a doctor. They take a Hippocratic oath to take care of people and blah, 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 blah. And as it turns out, like, yeah, half the time it doesn't really matter. The doctors have their thoughts, feelings, and their prerogatives and their preferences. And that's the end of it. And so I think having that specialized knowledge makes me very sympathetic to injured workers and what they go through, let alone on their own. At least I have the knowledge to know how shitty it is. People don't. And I think they expect the best from insurance. And at the end of the day, it's not there to protect you, unfortunately.
Definitely. Well, I don't think we could have stressed this enough. And I hope that it doesn't scare an injured worker that's listening to the podcast right now to come and think, the world is coming to an end. I better figure this shit out. No, it's literally just trying to give you an insight to what could potentially happen. Doesn't necessarily mean it's going to happen. It's going to be your case. It's just giving you an idea of how the workers' comp system works. It does benefit, but it also fails at some point. And in no way, shape, or form should you ever have to consider one or the other. It's just get it taken care of. Start with a workers' comp claim. It's better than not taking care of it and then it rippling just like our economy right now into pieces.
Yeah.
I think the last thing somebody would want who's just recently injured at work or is going through a workers' comp system is a bad economy and a bad outcome with their workers' comp case. I can't stress enough the consultations, the case evaluations, whatever you want to call them, the meeting with an attorney and going over your questions is free.
Yeah. And even if people, they don't want to pursue the case or they haven't decided yet, call a lawyer, talk with them. They can help strategize how and when to report the injury, what to say, what to do. They can answer all your questions for you so that you're going into the process educated. And if you decide not to pursue the case, that's okay too. I feel good about the people that sign up with my firm as clients. I also feel good about the people who don't. And I was able to educate them and explain things to them in such a way that they were able to make the best decision for themselves and their family, even if that meant, hey, maybe I won't file a case. Or you know what? Hey, maybe I'm better off doing this on my own. I think that at the end of the day, as lawyers, we want to take care of our community and specifically in the field we work in. And as long as we can do that, whether or not they're clients or not, that means a lot to us.
It does. Definitely does. Well, I want to thank you, Bilal, for joining us in this hard to talk about situation, and unfortunately it's something that we're all seeing in the news. You can't just pretend like it's not happening. And I wanted to thank you for joining us and shedding light on some of these topics and questions that could arise. I do apologize for the virtual setting for those of you that did get used to our in studio.
Sorry for my terrible audio. It's not like the studio.
I mean, if you take it back to the beginning of our podcast, it was worse. It's actually not that bad. I'm actually glad we haven't even had any glitches today. So it's been amazing. It's always been amazing to be able to share this type of information. If you do want to get a consultation, if some of the information that came into you today made you want to think about it twice, then you can totally hit up our sponsors, which we also thank for helping us out with the podcast, Pacific Workers. You can reach them out at 800-606-6999. And you can also visit them online at pacificworkers.com. Bilal, I don't have anything else to say besides thank you, because the information that is provided to communities always comes back in some way, shape, or form. There's people that are always commenting and saying, thank you for sharing this information. TikTok. I mean, we are on TikTok and people are constantly asking questions. And the fact that we're so reachable to them, it's amazing. And what best way than to throw a podcast and then throw it onto YouTube, share this information. If you have anyone or think of someone that might need a workers' comp attorney, or information in regards to a workers' comp claim, send them this video, share this video. You never know. So we'll catch you guys on the next episode of Work Comp Talk.